All right. Welcome everybody to this pre-Congress session on populism. Clearly, we underestimated the popularity of this topic. So hopefully, some of you can still sit on the stairs. A few more seats here, or more stairs, should I say, if you want to squeeze in. Populism is on the rise everywhere. It takes different forms. Think about Brexit, Trumpism. Different countries also experience the rise of populism to different extent. But it's nevertheless a very sizable and global phenomenon that is likely to affect policies going forward. So when my program co-chair Silvana Tenrera and I thought about the scientific content of this Congress, we thought this was a good time for us as a profession to take stock of what we know about the phenomenon, the exciting new research that's being carried out on the phenomenon, and also about what we can do as a profession to address the topic, study the topic, but also deal with the rise of populism. So we've brought together a set of 4 distinguished speakers who are currently doing work on populism and study different aspects of this. So there's clearly no pretense here to be exhaustive, but really to give different angles and open the debate. The rules of the game is that each of them is going to be given 17 minutes, not more, okay? If they manage during the presentation to in some ways react to a previous presentation, I'm going to give them a little bonus, but I do want to keep time for discussion at the very end. Okay, so here's just a few key questions to be dealt with, but in the interest of time, I'm going to give the first word to Sascha Becker from the University of Warwick.
If I get the mouse moving.
Oh, here.
No,
No, there is a machine to fix it. It's not easy.
The screen is extended, so if I
just need to find my slides.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so this is based on joint work I do with 2 Warwick colleagues, and 14 months ago I had no intention whatsoever to work on populism, but that was on the 21st of June, and then the 23rd came. So what we have as a starting point is that the UK seemed to be enthusiastic about the EU at some point, or its predecessor. Even Maggie Thatcher campaigned for the EEC at the time, when there was another referendum in 1975, just 2 years after the UK had joined. But now we are in a situation where the will of the people counts a lot, and where judges are called enemies of the people in the press, and where the people of this country have had enough of experts. And we'll hear more about that from Pierre Cahuc in his talk, I guess. So what happened then after the referendum is that with these 2 colleagues, we sat together maybe the week after the referendum and said, look, why did this happen? We don't really understand it, and try to write a paper on it that is now coming out in an issue of economic policy. So the motivation for that is that the UK voted to leave the EU, as you all know, and Brexit can be seen as a key moment in British history. It triggered a new government. There is a lot of uncertainty right now in the economy and for foreigners, and it dominates the media discourse. Every day, Brexit is on the front pages of all newspapers. There is a lot of polarization in the country, and when it comes to feelings about the EU, even within families, there are all these stories of parents and kids being at each other's throat about how they voted. Is it also a key moment of European disintegration or integration? Is Europe getting its act together now in some way, or is it going to disintegrate as some people have thought? We just don't know. The UK exit negotiations have just begun. So the question we ask here are, what are the fundamental factors behind the Brexit vote? This is a map of who voted how in the referendum, and you see that in different so-called local authorities, that's what the Brits call counties, the vote leave share varies somewhere between the lower 20s up to 75%. And there is a lot of variation across the country at a very macro-ish level, but even within relatively restricted areas, there's a lot of variation. Now, after the referendum happened, some MPs, some weird sample drawn by some social scientists of MPs in Britain was asked, what was the key reason that Brexit happened? And in this word cloud, you see that immigration features very highly. And generally, in the debate, often the point is made that this is all about the EU, as you might think, but is it really? So if we look at variation in the data, is it factors related to integration, such as trade shares with the EU, stock and flows of foreigners from the EU, from other countries around the world? So what is it really? In the public debate, trade and FDI often have a very good connotation in the media. They are not seen too critical, but immigration in the press, at least, is something that features extremely highly. But then it turns out in the data that the actual exposure to migration explains relatively little of the variation in the vote leave share. More important, in contrast, are age structure, education, and some measures of economic decline. So how do we go about that without going into details since I have no time? Whysoever that is turned around, I don't know, because it is upside down, strange. Anyways, what we do is we do a machine learning exercise. So we take a broad set of variables, and instead of, so to say, hand-picking variables that we think might have been factors in the Brexit vote, we let the data speak. So we pick sets of variables and have the largest predictive power of the vote leave result. Overall, using the whole set of variables we have, we can explain close to 90% of the variation with the variables we have. And if we go by subsets of variables, variables that in one way or another capture EU exposure, trade, migration, etc., explain the lowest share when they are taken by themselves. More is explained by public services measures, so whether there is good service by the NHS and enough places in schools, etc. But by far the largest explanatory power in terms of R squares comes from demographic variables in education. So for instance, low education predicts vote leave. And also economic structure, so sectoral structure, importance of manufacturing and so on. All that also explains quite a bit. But the variables that at least officially should matter, like EU-related things, matter least. What we also do is look at data within cities. So maybe these 380 counties are not finely disaggregated enough, so let's look within cities. And also within cities like Bristol, Greenwich, London, Nottingham, and Birmingham, there is a lot of variation. And that's not surprising, because ultimately the largest variation we have once we go to the individual level, where we have zeros and ones, yes, no. Yeah? And somewhere in between is areas where people that somehow are similar aggregate and live in the same neighborhood. And what we find is that also when we look at this within city variation, when we match that with measures of deprivation, those have quite some predictive power along the same lines of the variables we have at the local authority level. What we also did, not least because the editors asked us to, is to use the British model, take the British coefficients and bring them to French data and try to predict Le Pen. And that seems to be decently well. So very broadly speaking, that suggests that the same factors that drove people to vote leave in the UK also are the same factors that favor Le Pen in France. So finally, what we are working on right now, we got access to microdata from Understanding Society, the former BHBS, which has the Brexit referendum question at the individual level. So we can use individual level covariates and so on and go through a similar prediction exercise, but using individual level data. And that's because you might be worried about ecological fallacy when you use aggregate data and so on, but we seem to find the same pattern also at the individual level. And then this being a survey that has all kinds of additional variables that we don't measure at the aggregate level, we can also look at these additional predictors. For instance, people who are in worse health are more likely to vote Leave. People with less access to media and to technology and fast internet and so on are more likely to vote Leave. And also people on unearned income support and so on are more likely to vote Leave. So this whole paper, which is now coming out, is largely a prediction exercise. We don't make any claims of causality. We don't say, this factor caused vote Leave, but it's more a big descriptive exercise. Now, in order to get a little bit closer to causality, we have a follow-up paper with Timo Fetzer where we zoom in on one specific factor, which is migration from Eastern Europe. And that's currently in working paper status. And the motivation for that is that one of the variables we looked at some point in this previous paper was the UKIP vote share, the UK Independence Party, in European Parliament elections. Why European Parliament? Because different from the national elections in the UK, where we have first past the post, where people may vote strategically, knowing that if they vote UKIP, still the Conservatives win. In the European Parliament elections, also the British people vote by proportional voting. So they are probably more likely to vote also for UKIP. And it turns out that the correlation between vote Leave and the UKIP vote share has an R-square of 75%. So it's an extremely tight correlation. So we thought if we understand somewhat more about the rise of UKIP in European Parliament elections, that by extension also tells us a little bit more about the potential causal factor behind Brexit. One causal factor. So this is UKIP vote shares in the 1999 European Parliament election, which was the first where the Brits voted by proportional voting. And there the colors are all very lightly shaded because then as we move on, they jump up. So as you might know, UKIP now, currently, is the largest British party in the European Parliament. They got a higher vote share than the Conservatives and Labour, and in some parts of the country, well above 50%. So why that is again turned, no one knows, but that's what it is. Just by eyeballing, here you see, by eyeballing, again, the correlation between the referendum result and the UKIP vote share. Dark colours with dark colours. So what UKIP does is generally play with the idea that foreigners take away jobs of natives. The funny thing is this guy in the ad is an Irish actor, but that was the marketing agency who employed him. And they also play with this idea that there is pressure on services, that there are waiting lists in schools because of oversubscription due to migration. Now, could the UK have seen it coming that there might be a lot of migration from Eastern Europe? Well, there was a report commissioned by the Home Office, and I know the people who wrote it, academics in the UK, high-profile people, who were extremely careful in laying out what the assumptions are behind the numbers they produce. There is a range of numbers, but deliberately the Home Office wanted to pick the lowest possible numbers in all the scenarios, and that's what ended up in the early pages of the report. And the public claim and debate was, we expect 5,000 to 13,000 Eastern Europeans per year coming to the United Kingdom. Now, the issue that was overlooked, not by the academics, because at the time the report was written, the assumption was that all EU countries opened their borders to Eastern European migration from day one. At the end of 2003, in contrast, some countries argued for a transition period. And you see here the years in which transition periods ended. So the UK and Ireland, together with Sweden, are the only incumbent EU countries that opened their border to Eastern European migration from day one, whereas many countries, including Germany and Austria, the direct neighbors of Eastern Europe, had a 7-year phase-in period. Now that Polish people couldn't go to Germany, where did they go? Well, to the UK. So the actual migration numbers were far higher. That is based on stocks in 2001, and you see that by 2011 there are just 600,000 Polish people. Yeah? So per year, roughly 100,000 Poles came and not 5 to 13,000. So Tony Blair by now has completely forgotten about this and says we had no idea and that might happen. And he gets lots of other facts wrong in this funny newspaper article. There is obviously a huge literature on the effect of migration on voting across the world. I have no time to talk about that. But let me just mention a few highlights about this expansion in 2004 and 2007. Different from many of the other expansions of the EU over the years, this was the largest in terms of absolute number of countries, and it was the poorest set of countries. When Spain and Portugal joined, they were also comparatively poorer than the rest of the EU, but the Eastern European countries were far poorer and they were far more numerous. So the wage gap and thus the incentive to migrate may have been larger. So what we do in this paper is to look at UKIP vote shares in 4 European Parliament elections, 1999, 2004, pre-expansion, and 2009-14 post-expansion. Now you see another of these funny turned pictures, which shows you our main treatment variable. What we do in this map up there is dark colors indicate areas that received more migrants from Eastern Europe relative to the existing stock of EU migrants. So we are playing with this idea that areas that already have a lot of EU migrants are used to them, whereas areas that had few migrants so far are more likely to find an influx of migrants odd and threatening and whatever. Yeah? So we take this ratio as a treatment. But we can use alternative measures and things go through. So it turns out that the migration was largest into areas with low qualifications. So when we started, we thought we use this typical labor economics style shift share instrument. So using existing stocks of Eastern Europeans as a predictor of where new Eastern Europeans go. But that doesn't work because the only Eastern Europeans that were there were either people who were soldiers out of post-World War II army regiments, or it was high-skilled people who came after the Iron Curtain fell. So that instrument just doesn't work. Anyway, so we do matching and stuff like that. So let me just highlight the main result. In terms of UKIP vote results, what we find is that in a difference in differences framework, in areas that received a larger migration flow after 2004, UKIP vote shares increase over time by more. But I would like to highlight the size, just in words. In a median local authority district, the UKIP vote share went up by 1.7% in this post period. 1.7%, not percentage points. So it's really a tiny increase. Statistically significant, but numerically small. Also, what we do in the paper is look at various channels. So we ask, is it true that there is an impact on wages at different parts of distribution? There is a little bit at the lower end of the wage distribution. Is there an impact on the demand for services, on the demand for benefits, on housing markets, etc., etc.? And here and there we do find some effect, statistically significant, but typically numerically very small, from which we summarize that there is somewhat of a disconnect between the salience of migration as a topic in the public debate and the actual stuff happening on the ground. But obviously what could well be the case, but would need more research, is that people in areas with little migration are worried about the migration going elsewhere that might ultimately end up their way. So then it may be disconnected to what's happening on the ground. So I should stop, I think. If you have questions, you can email me.
Thank you very much for the perfect timing, Sascha. So Guiso is next.
Sure. And the timer? Can I?
have the wizard here.
Okay. So thank you very much, and I think it is a very timely session, right? And we know why. It is not because populism was popular in Argentina in the previous century, but because it got here. And the question that I'm going to address in the paper joint with Massimo Morelli, Elios Herrera, and Tommaso Sono, on which we are still working, instead of deepening on the British case, we are sort of taking a much broader view, because we are seeing that the phenomenon is sort of global. And I think that is the source of the worry. So the question is, why now, and why here in the Western countries? And we have a narrative of, that tries to address these two questions jointly. And essentially, the story is that the economic crisis that we are facing in Western countries is atypical. It's not, a standard business cycle type of downturn, both in terms of length, in terms of scope, and in terms of magnitude. There has been massive job displacement, partly due to exposure to globalization and trade. There has been mass migration that Sascha has been just documenting, particularly within Europe, but also from outside. And these areas somehow generated a spread of deep economic insecurity in the population. So economic insecurity is going to be the focus of this paper, and the source, I think, of that we are trying to push of the main explanation for why we see the rise of populism. And the idea is that there has been a failure of usual measures to address the crisis in all these dimensions, in the sense that both traditional responses, either on the left side, like government-oriented policies, or on the right side, like more market-driven type of interventions, have proved unsatisfactory to some extent. That has led, to economic insecurity. That has created demand for protection, and voters' disappointment with traditional politics has resulted in dissatisfaction with traditional parties and institutions, and has opened up, has created scope for anti-elite parties that offer, so to speak, cheap short-term protection. So in order to pin down and understand what is going on, the idea is that one needs both a story of demand, and needs to understand demand, which is mostly the focus of Sascha paper in the case of the UK, at least of the first paper. But you need also to understand supply. What are the drivers of the fact that populist parties, a populist platform becomes appealing, becomes successful. And so what we do, we try to understand both margins. And to give you a sense of the story that we are trying to tell, let me focus on Italy, partly because it's my country, so I know it better. But it extends to the rest of the European countries, I think. So if you look at the data, in 2008 there has been, we know, a deep recession with a dramatic drop in GDP and industrial production. So industrial production fell by something like 30 percentage points, and since then there has been no recovery. In parallel to the fall in industrial production, there has been a dramatic drop in confidence in political parties. The share of trust in political parties was something like 25% in 2008. You may say it's not great. Political parties are never popular anywhere, but it has dropped to something like 4 to 5% in the last few years. And at the same time, people started, dropping from elections and unattending elections. So a drop in turnout. So what happened was that the five-star movement, which is typically a populist movement, which was not existent in 2009, stepped in, and after a while it gained a lot of consensus. And today it is predicted to be the first party in Italy. The same story applies to Greece. You see a similar picture in Spain, and you see similar dynamics in France. So what they do in the paper is to try to put these features all together and build a story of the rise in supply of populism and why it has become appealing for the voter. So what I'm going to do is to talk a little bit about, first of all, what needs to be acquainted with the definition of what populism is. Try to bring some evidence on the drivers of voting behavior, playing and stressing the important role of the effects on turnout. Talk a little bit about the determinants of supply, and look at the responses of the other political parties. If there is time, I will touch a little bit about the effects of rhetoric, which may have to, sort of give some answer to the question that Sascha was asking about, why we see this reaction to immigration, but not to the actual immigration patterns, but to the beliefs about immigration. And then I'll go back to the big picture and perhaps discuss a little bit the implications and raise a couple of questions. So the data that I use for this paper is draws on two main data sources: the European Social Survey, which has mostly data on participation in elections and political party choice. And the second one is the Chapel Hill Expert Surveys that has data on parties' manifestos, position on issues, orientation, and so on, that is useful when you look at and you want to model supply. So what is populism? There is no clear definition. There is probably disagreement. The notion is vague and difficult to pin down. So when you don't know something about what is this, what you do, you resort to a dictionary. So if you look at the Encyclopedia Britannica, that is a sort of neutral way of getting a definition. The features that the Encyclopedia Britannica stresses is essentially a three-dimensional characteristic of populism. The first one is rhetoric. The fact that populist parties claim to promote people's interest and they are anti-elite. That is the first pillar of what populism is. The second one is protection. All populist parties tend to offer protection in different sorts. Can be, left-oriented type of protection, or it could be right-oriented type of protection that tends to pander to people's fears. And the third and important dimension is the fact that they tend to play down in their platform the long-term consequences of the short-term policies that they offer. So there is some degree of concealing in the policies that they advertise. Now, one needs to measure these features, and what we do, we rely on a classification that has been promoted by Van Kessel, as a political scientist. It is mostly based on the first dimension, on rhetoric. And the reason is that that is easy to observe. Just look at manifestos and look at speeches. And in particular, I recommend that you go through the Trump inaugural speech. That is clearly a populist manifesto. So it's hard evidence that allows classification. Secondly, it covers all parties and it is time varying. But the second one that relies on the three pillars is conceptually more appealing. So what they do is to use these chess surveys in order to get a clue of these three pillars. And what we get is the following, that if we build a measure of the three dimensions, that is the concealing, hiding, the protection measure, the rhetoric measure, and then combine them in a principal component, a measure of 3 dimensions index of populism, and then run a regression of each of these dimensions and the principal component on Van Kessel measure. What we find is that populist parties, according to Van Kessel, they tend to score higher in terms of rhetoric, in terms of protection, in terms of hiding, and overall in terms of the 3D measure of populism. So, the difference between a populist party, according to Van Kessel classification, and a standard party, in terms of the 3-dimension measure of populism, 90% higher score. Economic insecurity and the drivers of populism. So I'm moving to the second topic. What we find is that economic insecurity drives people's behavior along 2 dimensions and in important different ways. First of all, economic insecurity pulls people out of the political market. That is, they tend to stop participating in elections. This is the negative effect that you see here or here when we use the 3D dimension and we use the Van Kessel classification. At the same time, for those that go and vote, economic insecurity increases the chances that people pick up a populist party. So it has a dual role. It takes out people from the political market, but conditional on voting, they tend to choose a populist party. Secondly, other 2 variables are key. How much confidence people have in political parties. More confident people tend to be more likely to vote, and if they vote, they are less likely to vote for a populist party. And third, the sentiments towards immigrants. With opposite signs, those with adverse sentiments towards immigrants, they are less likely to vote, but if they vote, they tend to pick up a populist party. And economic insecurity here is a measure of, is a principal component measure that puts together unemployment experience, income difficulties, and exposure to globalization. Okay. Economic insecurity quantitatively is important because it has a direct effect. But we stress in the paper that even more important is the fact that economic insecurity drives also people's sentiments. It has a causal effect, we claim, on trust in political parties and attitudes towards migration. So when people feel more insecure, they tend to distrust politicians and political parties and institutions, and they tend to form more adverse sentiments towards migration. So if you put all things together, the direct and indirect effect, the indirect effect counts for something like almost half of the total effect of economic insecurity on turnout and voting. Supply. So there has been a sharp increase in the spread out of populist parties across countries, and even in the number of populist parties within each country. What drives the spread out of these parties is both how spread out is economic insecurity among voters, so where more voters tend to feel economic insecurity, it is more likely that a populist platform emerges. Secondly, exposure to foreign competition. And finally, some measures of the quality of the institutional setup in the country, and in this case, the strength of checks and balances in the particular country. Where checks and balances are stronger, this acts as a sort of barrier to the emergence of a populist party. Secondly, the orientation of the party. The definition that we are giving in terms of the 3-dimensional definition, that is independent of the orientation of the party. Both populist parties that lean on the left or on the right, they share the same features. But populist parties, they choose their orientation. And if you look at Europe, there is a high concentration of populist parties on the right. We argue that what explains the choice of the orientation is a strategic decision, and in particular where there is more disappointment. There is, if the ones that are more disappointed are the left-wing voters, then populist parties enter left. If the more disappointed are the right-wing voters, they enter right, and we find evidence that points in that direction. Reactions of traditional parties to populism. What we find is that incumbent parties, existing parties, tend to imitate populist platforms when they are successful. That is, in countries where the share of votes accruing to populist parties goes up, the distance in the platforms along different dimensions of the traditional parties and the populist parties shrink. And the reason is because, it's not because the populist parties became sort of more institutionalized, but it's the reverse. It's because the other parties are getting closer to the populist platform. Finally, there is an important, interesting question whether populist rhetoric matters to affect and the people's sentiments, both trust in parties and institutions, and perhaps how people translate economic insecurity into these sentiments. And we find that there is both a direct effect of the presence of a populist party on people's sentiments toward institutions and towards immigrants that can rationalize the Sascha point about the importance of people's immigrants. And also we find that there is an amplification effect. That is, where there is a populist party, people tend to translate the effect of economic insecurity tends to be magnified in terms of impact on trust in political parties and in terms of sentiments towards immigrants. So we find evidence of both. Maybe there is with some nice qualifications that maybe we can discuss if there is interest on this dimension. So the takeaways, just to wrap up, is that this is a very unusual crisis. There is pervasive economic insecurity, and there is failure along both the traditional left and the traditional right. And this is what opens up the room for a three-dimensional populist platform. The main driver is economic insecurity. It's not culture per se. There is no autonomous movement in sentiments, but these sentiments are triggered, are pushed by the economic forces and the reaction, the failure in the reaction to manage the crisis. A couple of questions, since you were asking them in 20 seconds. So let me start with the big question whether populism will vanish. My impression is that given the nature of the crisis, it is unlikely. Secondly, I think it should carry, what we are seeing should carry implications for the structure of the welfare system, in the sense that our welfare system is designed to manage business cycles, but it's not designed to manage the sort of crisis that we are observing. So that calls, I think, a little bit of attention on whether we should and could reshape the structure of the welfare system. And finally, whether we should worry. The fact that you are here, I think the answer is obvious. I think maybe you are driven here out of curiosity, maybe it's out of worry. So populism is a reaction to a political and economic crisis, but the reaction can be much worse than the crisis itself. Now, this is difficult to prove, but we can resort to history and let me just give you an example that I just took from the beautiful book by William Gottsman on the history of financial structure. And the story is, go back to a couple of thousand years BC. In the city of Lagash in Mesopotamia. there was this guy, Urucagina. He's probably the first populist guy in history we have sort of documented evidence. And he promised to restore the power of ordinary people as much as Trump did in the US today after an economic collapse. So he was able to overthrow the king and gain power, and so he abolished all the tax collectors and he canceled all the debt. Lagash was one of the most developed cities of the time, so people were relieved from debt obligations, but credit disappeared altogether, and that was the end of the economic success of Lagash. Okay, so I should stop here with this.
Perfect. Okay.
Example.
Thank you, Luigi. Thanks. Okay, so our next speaker is André Sapir.
No, not this one. Okay. Now, my presentation actually follows very closely from what we just heard. This is the study on which we have been working, 6 of us, Christian Dustman, Barry Eichengreen, Sebastian Otten, myself, Guido Tabellini, and Gil Fizega. The topic we have been working on is not exactly populism, but closely related, as we will see, but we are working on trust. And trust towards European institutions, but also towards national institutions. And we really built on the work by Sascha and on the work by Luigi. This study, by the way, will be released the day after tomorrow. It was meant to be released today, but it will be on the Vox EU, on the CPR website on Wednesday. So the study is finished, and so I'm just giving you some of the results. There are lots of tables, lots of regressions, lots of graphs in the study. Obviously, in 15 or 17 minutes, I'm only going to present a little taste of what we have done. Now, as I said, what we are after is really whether the EU is in trouble. Whether there is, partly because of the crisis, has there been a build-up of distrust towards Europe that one can fear for the future of European integration. In that sense, sure, Brexit is part of the story, part of the motivation. What has been happening in Italy, and that Luigi talked about, even though he talked more broadly, but the Italian case is certainly very, very symptomatic, is obviously also one of the motivations of our study. But we look at Western Europe, we look at all of Europe, but all of Western Europe, essentially. We don't look at the new member states except in a little bit. So, we are after seeing whether there is a problem of trust in Europe, what are its causes, and how does it relate to the issues of populism. As I say, we are really looking at trust, but somewhere, and I will show you some of the stuff that we do, we look to what extent populism and trust towards national institutions, towards European institutions, towards EU integration is related to populism, and to populism as defined the way Luigi has just done it. Now, we do believe that the EU is a particular strong target for populism. If you look at, back to the definition of populism, an issue of sort of elite project, of supranational, transnational, I mean, this is almost the definition of the EU integration process. So I think whenever there is a movement of populism, it's not just something that one should fear at the national level. I think one should fear of what it does for the EU project that is almost the first target for populist discourse or action. Now, what explained the rise of populism? And we'll just saw in the presentation by Luigi. I mean, there is this, in the literature, people discuss whether it's the rise of economic insecurity or the rise of cultural insecurity. But in a sense, the two are very much related to one another, and they relate to sort of more fundamental factors like globalization, like technological change, like the financial crisis, okay? And they can sort of generate insecurity, whether it's cultural or economic insecurity. Now, the kind of data that we use is, again, not unrelated to what we just heard. We use two sets of data. One is from the European Social Survey, where we have data at the individual level. And there, it's for every 2 years, from 2002 to 2014. We also use a European election database, where there you have actual voting outcomes at the regional level for the European Parliament. And this is for every European Parliament election from 1999 to 2014. As I said, we focus on Western Europe. And the dependent variable that we use for the part from the European Social Survey, sort of the individual level that we combine though with sort of regional data, we look at attitudes, trust towards EU integration and trust towards national and EU Parliament. And we also build a variable which is sort of the trust ratio, the relative trust towards the European Parliament vis-à-vis trust by the same individuals towards national Parliament. We have also data on individual level data on voting in national elections, and from the European election database there, we have regional level data on voting scores for pro and anti-EU parties in the manner that Luigi explained from the Chapel Hill expert survey, so the classification of parties. Now, we first do something which is sort of to look at how populism and trust are related. And we do ask whether there is a correlation. We don't talk about causation. We ask whether there is a correlation between populism and trust in national and EU institutions. And there, it's voting. And again, it's sort of a demand and supply element. Because indeed, we looked at populist parties' definition based on Engelhardt and Norris in a paper for 2016 that everybody quotes, and a very interesting paper that looks at, is it economic insecurity, is it cultural insecurity? And so we looked at voting for populist parties, and what we find essentially is that whether you're looking at trust in national parliament, which is on the top left, whether you look at trust in the European Parliament, or whether you look at people's attitude towards European integration, there is a strong correlation of all of those with voting for populist parties. So clearly the trust issue and the populist issues, they are closely intertwined with one another. So we decided to focus on the trust issue, but by doing that, obviously, we are very much aware that if you are losing trust, this is certainly a factor that promotes populism. So then, focusing on trust, we first describe, has trust in national and EU institutions declined over the entire period that we are looking at? And the finding is that, yes, there has been a decline, but somewhat at the end of the period, that is during the time of the crisis in 2012 and 2014. Remember that the data that we have there is for the attitudes, the trust is every 2 years, from 2002 to 2014. So yes, in 2012, 2014, you do see something happening, but it's not uniform across countries. There are huge variations, and I'm not going to go into all the detail, but for instance, when you look at our trust variable, our trust ratio variable, which is trust towards the European Parliament vis-à-vis trust towards the national parliament, there's a huge variation. In some countries, and you see it here, there's no data here for 2014. This is data for 2014. There's no data for Italy and Greece for those 2 years. But what you see here is that countries or regions that are in red are regions where there is more trust towards national parliament than towards European Parliament. And what you see is that the north of Europe and the south of the UK is where there is more trust towards national parliament than towards European Parliament. In the south, but also in Ireland and in Scotland, it's exactly the other way around. So this is just the picture for 1 year, but if you look at the evolution, there is this split in Europe between the north and the south in the relative trust towards national parliament and European Parliament. And so there is more trust in European Parliament in a sense in countries where there's low trust towards the national institutions. But we will see that the crisis did have an impact on this. Then we also look at the voting and whether voting has turned in favor of anti-EU parties. And there again, there's a lot of variation, although there is some kind of a trend. For the entire period that we have there from 1999 to 2014, on average, across the countries and across the period, there's about 20% vote for the what is called here anti-EU parties. But in 2014, that jumped again on average to 30%, again with huge variation across countries. Now, what is clear is that the UK here, on these numbers, but also actually on trust before, the UK is always an outlier. So wherever there is sort of low trust, there's more of the low trust in the UK. Or whenever there is voting for anti-EU parties, there's more of that in the UK. So if you were to put a UK dummy, we don't do that, but because we have variable for all the countries. But yeah, the UK comes out. But there is again difference between the southern countries and the northern countries, and even there are differences obviously, and we focus quite a bit on that on region, because our studies is at the regional level. It's not at the country level. We sort of exploit the regional variation. Now, how is the vote? This is the vote share received by anti-EU parties. How it has changed across time. Again, I'm not going to go over this, but. Okay, the top left is for all the EU countries, and then you have country by country here. And you see that the patterns are very, very different. And Italy is a country where, indeed, from 2009 to 2014, there's been quite a rise in populism. But, there are countries where it went up, there are countries where it went down. I mean, there's just no pattern that is... So there is on average something, but within this average, or behind this average, there are huge differences across regions, across countries. Then we do look at the determinants of this. What are the determinants of trust and voting patterns? Is it economic insecurity? Is it cultural insecurity? So we look at regional economic shocks. So what is regional unemployment? How has growth of GDP per capita evolved at the regional level? And we also look at regional cultural identity. So we extract from the survey data and from the responses some a variable authoritarian and a liberal variable, and then we have individual level data on age, gender, education, where people live, and etc. Now, what is it that we find? Well, we find first what everybody finds is that older and low educated people have generally lower trust towards both national and European Parliament, and also are less positive towards European integration. This is true for all countries, even though attitude levels are different. But everywhere you find that those groups, the older and the low educated, are less trustworthy of institutions and integration. And again, the UK is an outlier because it's much more than you find elsewhere. Then we look at the macroeconomic shocks, controlling for age and education and a bunch of other variables. We do find that negative macro shocks negatively impact on trust, both in European Parliament and national parliament. So both in national institutions and European institutions. But the size of the impact on national institutions is twice the size of the shock on European. So when there is a macro shock, in a sense, people are more angry at the national institutions than they are angry at the European institution, or they assign more responsibility at the national level than at the European level. And in a sense, then you find that the trust ratio improves in favor of the European institutions as a result of that. When you looked at the voting result, there is a negative macro shock negatively impacts on voting for pro-European parties. So pro-European parties suffer from, in European election, from a negative shock, and anti-EU parties do benefit, in a sense, from that. Then we did look at a specific crisis effect, sort of after 2007. So is there something beyond the macro shock? 2007 crisis and what followed was a macro shock. But was there also something, the way, let's say, the way EU poorly handled the crisis? Is there something specific? And we do not find very much. There is a small crisis effect, but much less than we had expected. It's a small, quantitatively a small effect. Then we interact the macro shocks with cultural traits. We do that at the regional level, and we do find that indeed in regions where there is authoritarian culture, in those regions there is amplification of the effects of the macro shocks. In the regions where there is a liberal culture that dominates, it's the opposite. You have a macro shock, and the macro shock is being dampened on its effect on trust by the liberal culture. On the other hand, what we find about trust, we don't find that for voting results. There is no significant impact of cultural traits, sort of more liberal or more authoritarian, interacting with the macro shocks on the voting at the European Parliament. So, conclusion of all of this. First, one would say, well, there is ground for measured optimism. Trust in the European Parliament, in national parliament, in voting for pro-European parties, they have not fallen dramatically in the crisis. They have fallen, but it's not been dramatic. And, the crisis does not seem to have really questioned fundamentally the trust that individuals have towards their national parliament or towards the European institution. So we say, let's be not too optimistic. There is no existential crisis here. The UK is special. That's what we find. Regression or graphs after graph, we find that the UK is special and that one cannot sort of go from what has happened in the UK with Brexit to other countries. And on top of that, there is no improved economic and political conditions. So one can say, let's be optimistic and look at the result of the election in France, in Netherlands. There's grounds for optimism. However, we feel that there is also grounds for caution, that indeed, and that was shown before, that some of the fundamental factors that are behind Brexit, they're also present in other countries. So when you look deep down at the characteristics of those individuals that have low trust towards European institutions, even towards national institutions, you find that, you find that not only in the UK, you find that in other countries. And yes, the macroeconomic conditions have become better, but, they could worsen in the future. So we feel that, one should be careful. We feel also that one should be careful because, in a sense, the EU is intrinsically fragile. I think we do recognize that there is a question of legitimacy in the EU. And the question of legitimacy is both, what political scientists call input legitimacy and output legitimacy. Input legitimacy is the question of the institutions and the participation of citizens in the European institution, the capacity to influence the outcome of policy. It's also the question of European demos. Okay, fundamentally, democracy is more at the national level than at the European level. So, and that's very hard to improve. One needs to improve, obviously, this input legitimacy, but it's very, very hard to do. And therefore, output legitimacy is, in a sense, more important at the European level than it is at the national level. Even with Trump, even with Brexit, the UK is not going to disappear. The US is not going to disappear. But a major shock that would happen about distrust towards Europe could have really a dismantlement of Europe. So we feel one has to be careful about legitimacy, and first and foremost, one has to work on the output legitimacy. And that's my last slide. The EU's priority need to be to regain output legitimacy. Now, what is output legitimacy? What is it that citizens are expecting that the EU delivers? And sure, we, and in this study and like in all the other studies, we concentrate in part on the economic matters and on the crisis and on the macro issues, unemployment, the growth effect. But we very much believe, and when you look at surveys at the EU level, that there are also demand for non-economic issues. So it's not just economic security, it's also non-economic security that is demanded by citizens. yes, one does need to address the input legitimacy. It's much more complicated, but needs to be done. If you look at the Rome Declaration in March for the 60th anniversary of the Treaty of Rome, 1957, the heads of state of the 27 countries met there. They signed a nice declaration, a 2 pages declaration. When you read their declaration, you see very much that European leaders are very much aware of the problems of legitimacy, both input and output legitimacy, and that the EU needs to do better in order to tackle the insatisfaction of citizens and some of the distrust that we have observed linked to populism. So let me leave it there. It's not just a question of declaration that they have signed. What we hope is that they follow it up with action. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So our next and last speaker is Pierre Cahuc. Pierre, you have got 17 minutes.
Okay. It doesn't work. I cannot move the it's a mouse. Sorry, it's a touchpad. You want to try? Okay, so it doesn't work. Huh?
I don't know where the mouse is.
No.
It's
You
extended.
You need a finger?
The mouse is there. We have to push.
Here, it's again.
Could you open? Okay. Thank you. Okay. It's me.
Wait. Okay.
No. It's not a good one.
It's
it's
over there.
there.
We can't.
I can see it. Okay, fine. Okay.
No, he hasn't. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so and I always said, so thank you very much for organizing this session on populism, and also for inviting us to present, to make a presentation. So actually, this is not a presentation for research. It's more about a book that has been co-written with André, which was in principle, I say in principle because the target was not really completely reached at a large audience, and it was entitled Economic Denialism, so it focuses on a particular aspect of populism, which is what we call scientific denialism, and scientific denialism is a denial of knowledge which is established on a scientific basis, meaning it's a denial of a kind of consensus knowledge, which is recognized by people who belong to a special field of research. And the book is focused on scientific denialism, which is applied to economics, and we've written this book because we had a feeling that, at least in our country, scientific denialism against economics is really and actually, the book has triggered many very strong reactions, about more than 200 papers in newspapers, more than 90% of them being negative. We get many supports by email from colleagues, but very few in the media. And I think one of the reasons was that it was really quite violent. It has to do with populism. And so what I want to do in this talk is to touch on 4 issues. Very rapidly about denialism in economics and in other sciences, the rhetoric of denialism that we already spoke about, and then also the power of denialism. Why is it so powerful? And I would like to end with some policy recommendation that we could discuss to try to see what the EIEF could do about improving what we do to try to fight against populism. So what is about denialism in economics and in other sciences? So when we started to work on this issue, we were really surprised to see that the feeling we had with respect to the public view on our profession was really shared by many other scientists in other fields, and especially in medicine, in biology, also in physics, because now there are many debates related to the climate, and obviously in climatology, and so there are many examples of very strong scientific denialism, and I think that the most interesting example is about the tobacco industry, which has instilled doubt about the harmfulness of tobacco for health. And this industry have been prosecuted by 46 American states in the 80s and 90s. And they had to pay at the end of the prosecution about more than 200 billion euros to compensate for the impact of their action on the American budget and on the American public. And so this event is very well documented by a marvelous book by Robert Proctor, which is so Robert Proctor is an historian in Stanford, I guess. And this book is very nice about the view how a lobby can try to elaborate a strategy about scientific denialism. So you have many other examples. Obviously, the creationists, people who are doing kind of scientific denialism against in medicine. I just spread out some examples on the slides, and obviously on climate. When you look at what people who work in physics and in climatology, apparently there is a very, very strong consensus. And for many people from outside, it's not obvious. And this is to a large extent apparently due to a very, very powerful discourses and very powerful strategy of very important lobbies. So, and in economics, obviously, we think that it's the field which is most confronted with denialism. And I think there are at least two reasons. First, in economics, the financial stakes are very, very important. And also people feel really a concern with most of the topic we deal with. And so they are very present in the media. And so there are many ways to try to convince people that what a field is doing does not make any sense. And so what the idea we have now is that obviously there are many debates about the status of our discipline, about economics. Is it a science or not? I guess that most of you think that we do science, but it's not something, this idea is not spread in all the population, I can tell you. And so what we try to push the idea, that, and what we are convinced that it's a true idea, is that now economics is not that different from many other experimental sciences. And one of the reasons is that we have, as you know, more and more access to huge databases. There have been, I think, a transformation of the way we deal with data, with causality issues. I don't need to speak so much about that here, but so meaning that we can reach on some issues some degree of consensus, which really relies on facts. Obviously, knowledge is always uncertain. I mean, in all fields, and it is the reason why we do research. I mean, we always want to doubt and to try to improve what we can know. And this is obviously true in economics, even if we have huge data set now. But however, we want to stress that there are claims that are clearly wrong according to the consensus of the discipline. So, for instance, with respect to medicine, it's when you say there is no clear evidence that smoking is not harmful for health. We know, all of us now, that this is not true. I mean, but for years and years, I mean, there was a very strong doubt about that. And in the realm of economics, this idea that finance is useless. The only way to reduce unemployment is to reduce working time to share jobs. I mean, increasing public expenditure is the only way to foster growth, or immigration always causes unemployment. We know, there is, I think, consensus to say that, these claims are not true. And so from this point of view, we are able to reach on some issues some consensus. And so why is it so difficult to convince people that we have no consensus? And so I think it's because there is a very strong rhetoric of denialism, which is very, very powerful and very convincing. So in the book, we describe the denialistic theory, rhetoric of many lobbyists, CEOs, journalists, and this is why we have so many negative reactions, I think, also of some of our colleagues who belong to strong to political parties or to associations with strong political orientations. And so the way these people try to spread doubts relies on four main arguments, which are found in all disciplines. This is what is really fascinating. First, I mean, the main strategy is to try to sow doubt and to denounce what they call the unique thought. I mean, we all share, I mean, if there is a consensus, the best way to try to destroy the consensus is to say there is a unique thought. And the unique thought is always very bad. I mean, it's not fancy to have a unique thought, to think all in the same way. And so this is the idea that, the business of these people who do lobby is to spread doubt, and doubt is their business. So there is also more, proactive strategy, which is like promotive alternative scientific or scholarly associations. The third pillar is to denounce mercantile or ideological interests. As you know, all mainstream economists are accused of being adepts of excessive deregulation, which is obviously always willed by international finance for people who criticize in some, the discipline. And also, there is something which is also very powerful, another argument which is powerful, which is to condemn science because it does not explain everything. As we know, we cannot explain everything. No science can explain everything, but the leading example here is about the crisis. Most economics did not foresee the financial crisis of 2008. Yes, and we are, I think, unable to foresee the next state of the financial crisis. If in medicine, people are unable to say when we are going to get a cancer, if once we are going to get it, but it doesn't mean that it's not a science or it's not a useful knowledge. And so this kind of strategy are very, very powerful because we are all of us threatened by scientific denialism when we step aside our field of expertise. Because we are very strong, we are all threatened by cognitive dissonance, as you know. So there are two main threats here. First, the confirmation bias. We want to find things that confirm our priors, and also what is called the identity productive cognition, which is a way to say that you want to have some loyalty to your cultural group. You want to find facts that corresponds to what is spread in the cultural group. I'm going to give two examples about that. And so there is now empirical evidence showing that culture is cognitively prior to facts in the sense that individuals selectively credit and dismiss factual claims, so in a manner that really support their preference, their preferred vision of the world, of the good society. And so there has been some fascinating work about that done by Dan Kahan, who is a lawyer and psychologist at Yale University. And so I'll just tell you what is on this graph. So on the horizontal axis, you have this is a survey. You have this is a survey about people who are asked questions about their competence in science. So you ask some people some questions about their knowledge in science. And this is increasing with the degree of competence in science. And on the vertical axis, you have the probability to answer correctly to the question, according to the theory of evolution, human beings, as we know them, developed from earlier species of animals. So this is a question on science, the knowledge of science. And so obviously, you see a positive, people who have more competence in science know more often that according to the theory of evolution, human beings develop from earlier species. And here you see that on the right-hand side graph, you have the degree of different curve for the degree according to the degree of religiosity of people. So in yellow, you have people who have above average religiosity, and in blue, you have people below average religiosity. So you find a positive also relation for the two types of people. But now, if you ask the question differently, if you ask, according to your prior, to the same people, human beings, as you know them, develop from earlier species of animals. So what you see is that people who have a high level of religiosity, when they have a higher level of scientific competence, then they disagree with this claim more often. Even if they know that the field, as I've shown in the previous graph, even if they know that the field according to the field, to science, I mean, this claim is true. And so why is it so? It's because these people feel more comfortable to criticize the scientific consensus. And so, and also they feel more comfortable to criticize the scientific consensus to be in line with the main prior of their group. Okay, so you see, and these people are us, obviously. I mean, this is a survey, so this is a representative survey of people, and so meaning that scientific denialism is really can be very strong people because we have very strong cognitive dissonance in many situations. So. What should we do, knowing that we and all people have very strong cognitive dissonance? I think that we have to fulfill some kind of principle not to be misused, and to think about these principles to elaborate some strategy which could help our profession to spread, I mean, the kind of scientific consensus. So the principle way to fulfill that, not to be misused, I think, are first to look for the scientific consensus of the field and whether it exists. This is not always easy because most of the field do not provide tools to find this scientific consensus. And also, we have really to be aware that, I mean, if you have a result that appear for the first time in a book, in a large audience book, or, which contradicts the kind of scientific consensus, I mean, it has really no reliability, finding. And so for people, there is obviously the issue of conflict of interest. And so conflict of interest go well beyond, financial stakes. Researchers who are engaged in political or associative life are likely to make judgments that reflect their commitment to their group much more than their scientific consensus. So we also have to be aware of that and to try to fight against this kind of attitudes. And so from this, what can we get in terms of policy recommendations could be relevant for our association, European Economic Association. To deal with this issue, I use what we have done with André, but also Agnès Benassi-Kéré, Olivier Blanchard, and Jean Tirole have written a very recent report for the Conseil d'analyse économique. I think it's going to be translated in English, so it's going to be available for more of you. But where they try to give some recommendation to improve in France the communication of economists. And so first kind of thing that we could do is to continue to disseminate good practice within the economic scientific profession. And so we do that when we publish papers in the Journal of the European Economic Association. We have to give some declaration of interest. We could try to spread it more, to all members of the EIEF to provide their declaration of interest. It will provide more confidence to what we do. Something I think which would be very, very important, which will be to develop and advertise a panel of economic experts, which will be interviewed on practical economic issues or economic policy. Actually, most of us are not aware about that, but these kind of policy experts exist. And there is one organized by the University of Chicago, and there is a panel of European experts. And so the idea that they ask some questions, like at a low frequency, 1 or twice a month, and they have to answer, and they can answer to if they want. And so they give a ranking, they give their position on a 0-10 scale in terms of the answer to the question, but also in terms of the degree of confidence with respect to the questions, to their answer. And so this is a way to know whether there is a consensus or not. And just to finish, the two last recommendations: publish or upgrade regularly a list of researchers who could intervene in public debate, but making sure that these researchers have the good feel of competence and no conflict of interest, and also organize closed session of reciprocal training of researchers and journalists on major economic themes. Okay, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Pierre. All right, so we have about 10 minutes for question and answers. What I suggest we do is that we collect about 3 or 4 questions out of the room, and so that to get reactions. I'd like people to raise their hands if they want to ask questions, and I'd like to ask you to be brief when asking your questions. So there's a question here first. Can you stand up and then speak? There's a microphone here.
I think I can speak out loud. So it's more of a general question, I don't know exactly to whom, but it's a question that refers to how do you see that other political parties respond to the rise of populist parties? So do you see that they come up more with facts, when there's sort of fake news, that there's facts, or that they respond in sort of becoming more populist themselves as well? So I remember one of the presentations said that maybe we can see that populism is in decline because in the French and Dutch elections, actually, the populist party didn't win. Is that is that true, or is it that the other political parties became actually a little bit more populist so that they sort of
Good. Okay. So, yeah. Another question? Yeah.
My name is Pierre. I come from the Netherlands, and I'm quite regularly involved in the public debate. And when I talk to journalists, they often complain that the best and the brightest professors are not available when they are called and to comment on economic development. So shouldn't we look at ourselves and get more out in the open when we're being called? And maybe our academic incentives are a bit misguided, that knowledge transmission to the public is not rewarded, whereas high-rank publication in the Journal of Economic, European Economic Association, that's where you get a career out of.
Yeah. Other questions? No? So then maybe I'll let Luigi respond to the first question. You seem to be the natural.
Surely. So the evidence that we have is that in a systematic way, the other parties tend to adapt to the platforms of a successful populist party. That is, when populists gain a larger share of votes, what we find is that the positioning of the other parties gets closer to the position of the populist party. And this is across all issues we look at, like, position towards the EU integration, ideology, and single political matters like government intervention, redistribution, taxation, and so on. And we document that this is because it's not because the populist party, once becomes successful in terms of vote share, becomes more sort of responsible. It is because the others tend to imitate the populist party. Now, this is interesting in terms of overall supply of populist proposal, because this is saying that when a populist party becomes successful, that is going to have a multiplier effect, because it's going to condition and affect the strategies of the other parties as well. There is also more sort of casual evidence. For instance, in Italy, Renzi was the prime minister, when was it, 2 or 3 years ago, and both in terms of action and in terms of symbols, he was, in order to try to counteract and sack a little bit of the consensus of the rising five-star movement, he was becoming a little bit populist. So, he started promoting transfers to the relatively low-income individuals. That was a sort of populist-oriented policy. But most importantly, it was acting on symbols as well. Like avoiding displaying both the Italian and the European flag in public speeches. And so was trying to, to move into the direction of the anti-European type of populist platforms. So the impression is that so far the success of populist party is triggering imitation on the side of the others.
Yeah, so I think André wanted to also react.
Yeah, I just wanted to add 2 things to this. One is that in our study, I mean, in a sense, we don't use the term as you did, supply and demand, but I think this is a very, very useful approach. Is a demand supply of populism, and as we did, like you look at this data, the chess data, and look at platforms. Now, what we do not see, except for Italy, and Italy there is an outlier. We do not see a trend, again, up to 2014. We don't see a trend of, in a sense, infection. From one party, there's more and more sort of populism. In Italy, you do see that platform, sort of the supply of populism has increased in 2014, certainly. So that's one factor. So, I want to caution a little bit that, maybe the Italian example, hopefully, is not spreading to other countries. The other question is, what will be very interesting for all of those studies that we have been talking about is the 2019 elections. We are going to have European election in 2019. So I think it will be an opportunity to test some of the results that all of us have found. What is our prediction for the 2019 election based on the different variables that we have, and what's going to be the outcome of those populist parties?
Thank you. So for the second question, Pierre is a natural person to respond, although I'd like to hear also, there's been so much trauma in the UK about Brexit and the role of experts, so that I'll give you a word also afterwards, right? Pierre.
Okay, so you're right. It's difficult to intervene in the public debates, and to the extent that people who are doing research already very actively have no time to do it, and they are not that much present. And I agree with you, there is a problem of reward, but on the other hand, it's very difficult to organize. And I think this is one of the reasons why we should try to do something. For instance, in one of the proposals, if you have some panel of experts, and we need to have a label, okay? And that's to be able to reward these kind of interventions, because people intervene in the public debate for many different reasons. You have some economists who do that for ideological reasons, and this is not what we want to reward. And so I think we need to organize this, and one of the ways to do that could be to have a kind of panel of experts. It will be good to be on this panel. It will be rewarded. And the activity on this panel will be rewarded, but we can also think of other things that will be organized to have a way to give, to have a link between what is done in research and what goes to the media. And so this is one of the proposals, but it could be many other proposals, I think.
Yeah, I think it's right what Bas says, that there is not necessarily incentives for all of us academics to go into the media, but also those who have done so, especially with topics like Brexit, you may be subject to hate mails and accusations on social media. You may get letters in the mail and stuff like that. And I think some people just don't want to have that and rather prefer their ivory tower just because of this emotional stress, not because of being challenged on content grounds, but just because there is some hate around for certain topics.
All right, so technically we have 2 minutes more, so we could take another question if there's a pressing question.
So this is for André. You mentioned at the end of your discussion about the need to tackle non-economic insecurity. How do you do that?
Okay, we are a bit short on proposals. The report that is coming out is really a report that analyzes the issues. And we do at the end sort of make broad proposals like the ones that I have described. We did not get into the specifics about what to do. But it's very clear, for instance, when you look at, again, sort of those Eurobarometers, those surveys of citizens, and you see what is it that citizens complain about. What is the EU not doing well, and what is it that you wish? You do see that there's a lot of non-economic stuff out there. There is economic stuff, and one of the typical things about unemployment or sort of, social justice. But there's a lot of non-economic matters, like defense, for instance. So that is a clear. It's a clear element that comes out. And people have been exposed to all kinds of events, not just the economic crisis, there have been other crises in Europe, of which non-economic elements, I think, are playing a big role.
Right, so it's time to finish. Thank you very much, all of you, for your